This afternoon I want to talk about two areas, Wapping and Bermondsey. And as somebody has already pointed out, aren't these from London? Yes, they are. The name Wapping derives from an Old English word, warple, which means marsh. And it was because Wapping was originally marshland, which was later drained. But this is not Wapping in Bradford that we're talking about. This is Wapping in Tower Hamlets in London. So that area was originally marshland. I think you have to go back to Anglo-Saxon times. It's always been a bit of a mystery as to why a district of Bradford was named after a district of London. But it is absolutely certain that that is the case. That's why Wapping in Bradford was named after Wapping in Tower Hamlets. Yeah. Now, there are theories, but there is no consensus over why. So the first theory is that there were many children apparently from places in London like Wapping who were, for whatever reason, were brought up to Bradford from workhouses in London and resettled in Bradford. And so perhaps it was a nod to that. It's a theory, it's not proven. Another is about the docks in Wapping, which is probably the thing that it's most famous for. And trying to create parallels between the docklands in London and the end of the Bradford Canal, which opened in 1774. And then the other theory is that it's to do with the wool textile industry, because Wapping's docks became a major location from the import of wool from places like Australia. And so maybe it's just simply to do with that, the connection. And it could well be more than one reason. In terms of the area that we're talking about, again, it's very imprecise because Wapping was never an official district. And a lot of it has also, changes to the layout of Bradford's roads has made it a bit more difficult when you're tracking back in history to compare like for like. But basically, you could say Canal Road is to the west, you follow the edges of Foster Square to the southwest, and then Church Bank and Barker End Road up to the roundabout, and then Otley Road east up as far as Airedale Road, and then you just somehow go along the top there, somewhere around there. Although there is not an actual road that goes all the way across to follow. It's probably the largest of the lost neighbourhoods that we've been looking at. A lot of them, like when the first one, Longlands, was relatively small. We talked about White Abbey this morning. That was bigger than Longlands, but again, not enormous. This is very big in comparison. You start off with what is now today the city centre down here, and then you extend far out of what is arguably the city centre. This area, apart from the parish church, which later became the cathedral, and some outbuildings around that area, the first major development was the canal, which was finally opened in 1774. So Bradford Canal was 3.5 miles. It was a spur canal that linked Bradford with the Leeds and Liverpool Canal at Shipley, and because it dropped 86 feet from Shipley to Bradford, it needed 10 locks to manage this. I'd never actually quite realised there was that many locks on the canal. When you consider the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, so when I lived in Silton especially, I used to walk the canal quite often as far as Shipley. There are locks along it, but there aren't an enormous number of locks on it, and I said most of them are sort of around Bingley area, 5 rise and 4 rise. Now, initially, stone was the main cargo for the canal. For instance, limestone from Skipton end that would be taken into Bradford. But by the 1790s, other things were added to that. Finished iron products and coal were exported out of Bradford using the canal. Wool from Australia was imported into Bradford. And by the 1820s, you even had passenger services. You could catch a barge to Leeds or to Selby. I don't quite know how you connected with Selby. I don't know how that worked. You must have had to have gone to Leeds first. But I don't know. Was there ever any canals? Does anybody know that went from Selby to Leeds? Or does the Leeds
air coal navigation in Leeds?
So would that, you'd have to go to a river then, wouldn't you?
Yeah, you'd have to go to sort of navigable rivers, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
I was very surprised when I was reading up about this and found Selby being named, and I was half tempted to just miss the name out, but then I thought, no.
When you're in the centre of Leeds, the canal become a river.
It does, doesn't it?
Doesn't it? So
yeah, that's right. Yeah. So you'll be right. Yeah, it'll be. You would have ended up on a river.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the sort of area that it's ended up with, if you can see this. So aside from the canal, the area began to develop after the construction of Bolton Road in the 1820s. And I think a lot of what happened was as a result of the canal coming to Bradford as well. That sort of triggered things, really. And other major routes were soon built: Wapping Road, North Wing, and the area basically rapidly began to urbanise. But this is a much, much bigger piece of land that we're talking about. It was, again, just like all the other areas we've talked about in previous sessions, densely packed, back-to-back terraced houses for work accommodation, and also, businesses themselves, of mills and factories in the area. I suppose, arguably, when you do look at the map, there are still some gaps. There are still some, maybe it isn't as densely packed as some places. So, for instance, when we talked about Broomfields on the session before Christmas, Broomfields became so overdeveloped that there was a shortage of land in the area. There was basically no green land left in the area. I don't think they ever went as far as that with Wapping, but it was certainly packed full of houses. By the 1840s, what we would call Wapping was about 7.8 acres, about 390 people per acre living in the area. And just the same as all the others. Poorly built houses, no real sanitation, air pollution, disease. It very quickly degenerated into a slum area just as quickly it had actually been built. So it was not very long for that to happen. And in 1845, the Bradford Woolcombers Report talks about Wapping. The Woolcombers Report was almost like a census of all the different districts making up Bradford, and it didn't have any positives to say about any of them, really. But they called it an ill-paved, extremely filthy neighbourhood. The inhabitants are generally unhealthy, subject to malignant diseases. The cholera made dreadful ravages in this locality. So the cholera outbreaks that happened. Like the other areas, Wapping was served by a large variety of shops and businesses. Bolton Road and Wapping Road.
You said another Delvers, John. As in, one in Peter, wasn't it?
Yeah. This is definitely in Wapping.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you had basically what were effectively like high streets that were developing as well. Butchers, greengrocers, pawnbrokers, pubs. There was a fancy good shop. There was a shop that sold pies and peas and tripe as well. Lovely. And there was a very large Irish population again. And surprise, surprise, the area was regarded as a rough area. And we were talking earlier about how these areas that had the particularly bad reputations always seemed to be Irish Catholic areas. Was that fair, or was that a form of discrimination? But many of the pubs, again, in Wapping were regarded as centres of criminal activity. So there were people trading black market goods, illegal gambling, prostitution, that sort of thing, really. And although perhaps not as much as White Abbey, there was again an issue with what they called whist shops, which is these illegally set up pubs that didn't have a licence. But people would set up in a house until the police raided them and closed them down. Again, in 1830, when the law was changed and you could set up a beer house without a licence, but you just bought a certificate from the Exchequer, that largely got rid of the problem. Again, most of these whist shops then became actual bona fide beer houses instead. Now, apparently from the reading I've done, there were some minor improvements to the area during the latter part of the 19th century, where some of the worst examples of slum properties began to be cleared, but it was a bit like tinkering on the edges, really. There wasn't any major efforts to try and improve conditions, and most of the housing remained overcrowded and poor quality housing as well. So it would be typical for someone to step straight into the living room when you went into one of the houses. There'd be one window, fireplace, which would have the side boiler and an oven. It wasn't always the case that you might have a scullery or a kitchen. Sometimes you did, sometimes you didn't. And usually the sanitation were privy middens, and you'd get night soil men that would empty them and then would disinfect the streets afterwards. So people would talk about the ground being turned white with a disinfectant outside. But that sort of gives you an example of just how primitive things were. And you've got what were effectively homeless people. There were lodges where people would just stay, would only be able to stay for one night. But to be honest, a lot of the housing was like that anyway, because, as I said earlier, with White Abbey, it was, some people might have a bit more security, but it was quite common for people to just pay per night stay, and you'd just have an area of a house to sleep on the floor, unless you were lucky. But then there were places like the Lodge House on Captain Street, where 1881 census said there were 90 men and 18 women who were occupying it. And these were not people who were just unskilled labourers. You had tradespeople, plumbers, shoemakers, tailors, quarrymen. There were people of various trades, and yet they still didn't have the security of a house. Schools. Wapping as an area tends to be a little bit more famous because of a particular school. Anyway, first half of the 19th century, you get a Catholic school opening and a parish school opening, an Anglican parish school, both on Stott Hill, which is behind what was then the parish church. So these will have been elementary schools, sort of reading, writing, arithmetic, and religious studies, of course, as well, which are probably even more important. But then, 1870 Education Act, which was largely put down to Foster, the Bradford MP, introduces compulsory elementary education across the country and sets up school boards across different areas, whose job is to basically to fill in the gaps where there's a need for schools that churches and charities are not currently providing. So the Bradford Schools Board opens a non-denominational school for Wapping, and initially that's on Cambridge Place, but later it's on Wapping Road, and I think it gets renamed Wapping Road School eventually. So this is Margaret Macmillan's time. 1886, the head teacher of Wapping Road School, Mr. Sykes, he said that he had to provide free school meals for 30 children. Now, it actually wasn't quite legal for schools to provide free school meals until 1906. There was no Act of Parliament that actually provided them with the right to do so. So it wasn't illegal, it was unlawful. You know, it was breaching of legal duties, if you like. But that was in many ways a flavour of the social progress that was starting to happen in Bradford, and the realisation there were people in need and we needed to do something about it. And in the notes, the staff of the school also observed how distressed and impoverished the residents, and including the children, were who lived in the area. And there were frequent child absences to the school because of various illnesses that went round. Sometimes the whole school would have to close depending upon what type of illness it was. And there has been for a very long time a lot of research that shows that if you live in persistent poverty, you're more likely to suffer from poor health, and especially if you live in an overcrowded situation where diseases are more easily transmittable and that sort of thing. Now, Wapping School, or Wapping Road School, is probably the most famous for its swimming pool, which opened in 1877. And it was only 14 metres by 5 metres, but it's thought to be the first municipal school bath in the UK, and it later got nicknamed Wapping Puddle. Apparently Green Lane Primary opened a swimming pool only a few years after this. And I don't know if that was the second in the country, but it may well have been. But it certainly was one of the first after this. But we talked this morning about Green Lane in White Abbey, first free school meals and first warm free school meals in the country, and then Wapping Road School, first municipal swimming pool. Now, after the First World War, the area was one of these that was flagged up as being for slum clearance. So, previous sessions we've talked about how the Longlands district was the first area to get slum clearance, and the template approach of building social houses somewhere else and then moving the residents there, demolishing the slum neighbourhood, and then building new social housing. And then after Longlands was done, First World War happened. After the First World War, Bradford Corporation started looking at other slum areas like White Abbey and Wapping. And mostly the demolition of Wapping happened during the 1930s. Most residents were given housing on Canterbury Estate. Canterbury had actually been built, I think, originally for residents of Broomfields near what's now the interchange. But there were people from other estates for other neighbourhoods that were also offered housing there. Second World War comes along and halts the process, but then in the 50s the remainder of the original housing is cleared, and residents are offered homes on the Swain House estate in Bolton. Eventually, after the demolition of the slum housing in Wapping, new social housing began to be built into the area. So, Churchbank, Otley Road, and other places, a lot of which were tower blocks. Yeah, so like on Churchbank, I don't know if they're going to get rid of the tower blocks or not now. I know they have down at Holm Top, haven't they? Sort of near, or they were doing, off Manchester Road, but yeah, there were lots of tower blocks. There were other houses built in the area as well, but a lot of the area was left derelict for a long time. So it wasn't exactly great regeneration for a long time. You just had land that was just left, and eventually one of the things which started to tidy up the area was the Shipley-Airedale Road was built, and that might be part of the reason why the land was left derelict, because the council wanted to build the road, didn't really want there to be anything in the way of that. Now, effectively, when the Shipley-Airedale Road was built, it cut Wapping in two. So I would say particularly the lower portion of Wapping, around where the corn dolly is and the Ring of Bells used to be. That tends not, well, I don't think any of it really gets called Wapping anymore, but that area started getting called the Cathedral Quarter quite a lot more. Just going back a bit, Bradford Canal. So we mentioned Bradford Canal opening in 1774. Bradford Canal, it struggled to survive for a long time. So you got housing and other buildings springing up adjacent to its banks, so you ended up with sewage spilling into the waters. A lot of mills also decided that they would take water out of the canal and use it in their processes, and then they would return it to the canal, probably not very clean. And that didn't help with maintaining water levels, and generally the quality of the water in the canal was not very good. The pollution content in the canal water was so bad that in 1845 there was a fire. So sulphur that was within the waters of the canal caught fire, burned. So after that, Bradford Corporation decided to try and classify the canal as a public nuisance, and they wanted to raise the money to purchase it and to close it. So they tried, because of controls even back then with local government, they tried to get an Act of Parliament passed that would authorise a loan that would give them enough money to then buy out the company which owned the canal. But Parliament would only pass an act which was of a lower amount than what they were asking for, which was insufficient. So in the end they sort of abandoned that approach. But they really had it in for the canal even back then. 1867, there's a court order closing and draining the canal on health grounds. So by this point, the Bradford Corporation has got its way and decided that it wants the thing shutting down. But this starts to cause issues. So the transportation of stone into Bradford is disrupted as a result of this. So there's a new company called the Bradford Canal Company that's formed that wants to buy it, that wants to reopen it. And this happened by 1872. But this isn't actually really changing any of the issues that were behind it closing to begin with. And as was being said, things have changed by now. So a lot of the stock that was being transported in and out of Bradford by canal is now being transported in and out by rail instead, which is a lot more reliable and quicker. And so this, along with the ongoing problems that the canal's having in just keeping itself going, it makes it almost impossible for the canal to pay for itself, because it will have charged, for usage of the canal. 1922, Bradford Canal is closed for the last time. And since then, most of its waterway has been either filled in or built on. A lot of people have been very sad about the idea. I have to say I live near Skipton. We have a canal, but it's really tiny though. And it was only built because the family that owned the castle wanted a spur canal to the castle. It is much smaller. There were proposals to reopen the canal or create a new canal and potentially extend it further into the city centre during the 2000s. I actually knew a guy, I won't name him because I shouldn't do without his permission, but he was a regeneration officer on the council who was, part of his brief was to look at this project. And he told me from very early on, it's not going to happen. There was this real pipe dream idea that they could give planning permission to developers to build houses along at least one side, and because waterside houses were so much more expensive and they would make money from doing that. But part of the problem was Bradford Metropolitan Council hadn't a clue what to do with managing a canal really. And they did approach the Leeds and, the people that run the Leeds and Liverpool Canal and asked them, would they take it on if they built it? And they said, yeah, we will do that, but we want an endowment from you. And that endowment would have been, a lot of millions of pounds, which was just not going to be available. So they said, no, well, forget it. You do get private canals, don't you? But So it just came to nothing in the end. Well, came to nothing.
Is that photo in Shipley?
It's at Dockfield.
Yes.
Towards the end of what was the Bradford Canal.
Yeah.
That's right. So, canal was really one of the things that I would say spurred on a lot of the development of Wapping. That had gone by this time, 1922. After the Second World War, there were still a lot of shops, there were still a lot of businesses that were in the Wapping area, but with the slum clearances that had happened before and after, a lot of those disappeared. As people disappeared, a lot of the buildings were removed. And then from what's been left in the area since, most of the pubs have ceased trading. I mean, think about Bolton Road. I remember at one time there being at least 3 pubs on Bolton Road, and now there's just one. There was the Ring of Bells, the Corn Dolly, and again with a G. There was another pub a bit further along.
Not Guysborough, it was
Goldsborough. That was it. Now there's one. There was the Cock and Bottle that was further along. I actually knew the family that ran that for a time.
Oh, yeah, Papermill, wasn't it? Is it Papermill?
Yeah.
That oldest building in Bradford?
Oh yes, that's right, yes, yeah. But of course that's, the Cock and Bottle is now shut.
That's a scandal.
Yes, yes. And generally, facilities in this area has just disappeared and dwindled, and that's thing like any area that is a proper community has to have these places that people use, people meet one another, get to know one another, that sort of thing. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult to have genuine community spirit. Bermondsey. This is actually quite a famous picture of Bermondsey, if you know about Bermondsey. This is Bermondsey in Bradford as well. Okay. This is around where Manor Row is now, and the Midland Hotel. And I think this was something was being demolished, obviously, at the time. But yeah, this sort of gives you a good picture as to what it looked like.
What's the thing there about Australia?
Passage to Australia.
That's not your 10 bob.
No. This is far too early.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah.
That was post-war, wasn't it? Post-war.
Yeah.
So Bermondsey, different Bermondsey. So again, the name Bermondsey means Bermondsey Island, and it refers to an area of high dry ground that was near marshland in the Thames. And again, this goes back to Anglo-Saxon times. So it wasn't really a proper island. It was just you had marshland and then you had a bit of high ground that wasn't marshy. And whoever Bermond was, it was a person it refers to. And again, we're talking about a district in London, except this is in Southwark. As with Wapping, there is the question of why was yet another neighbourhood of Bradford named after a district of London? But again, it's certainly the case. And whatever the logic was behind it, whatever originally motivated people to name Wapping, well, it'll be the same reason that they decided to name Bermondsey, because Wapping and Bermondsey were right next door to one another. So it's the same again. The theories that are raised as to why this is the case. So one theory is to do with this idea there were children that were brought up from the area, from workhouses in London that ended up being resettled in Bradford, and maybe they were resettled into this area. Another is there are warehouses and wharfs that line Bermondsey's riverside, and the most famous is Butler's Wharf. And again, it's this idea of trying to create parallels between these places on the Thames and Bradford Canal as being this place that goods are imported and exported out of.
Are Bermondsey and Wapping in London adjacent, or are they in different places?
I don't think they're quite next to one another, but they're not. Yeah.
Still on the eastern side of
Yes.
Yeah, the London Jumpers got.
And they both got riversides as well. Yeah, and then another idea is Bermondsey had a connection with the wool trade, so perhaps because of the connection, wool textiles in Bradford. Now, Wapping, all right, Wapping was quite big, and it probably was the biggest of the districts that we've been talking about because it spilled so far out of the city centre, from the city centre. Bermondsey was exactly the opposite. So we're talking about such a really small area. So, roughly, North Parade and Darley Street to the west, Kirgate and Lower Kirgate to the south, Valley Road to the east, possibly further, because I'd said Canal Road possibly for Wapping, so maybe somewhere around here. And then what was now Hamstrasse to the north, but Hamstrasse obviously is a post-war thing, so it wouldn't have existed when Bermondsey was around. It's probably the smallest of the areas that we're going to talk about. There isn't an awful lot to talk about concerning other than it existed, it had a name, and it's really strange that they named yet another area of Bradford after a district of London. Right. See how much I've lost. Be alright. Right, I've forgotten where I was now. So yes, Bermondsey basically was a very late comer in terms of these districts, and it didn't last for very, very long. And I think a lot of it was down to the extension of the train station and how that affected that area as well. So then, just as a sort of final aside, yeah. So Bradford Foster Square was truncated in 1993. So the powers that be decided that we needed a much smaller station, slightly to the north. So that was built, and the old station was demolished at the same time. And where the old station stood, we've had things like the Royal Mail sorting office down there instead. Which I think is actually now closed and all been moved to Leeds, actually, that operation. But yeah, we've ended up with a much smaller, compacted station, a bit further out, that's now surrounded by this, well, not surrounded, but one side is dominated by this retail part. Again, that's pretty much all I have to talk to you about, to share with you. So, does anybody have any questions or anything that they want to share?